All right, good morning, Trevor. Great to see everybody. So we're gonna jump right in. This week's parsha, massive, and we're gonna tie it into obviously the title, massive because we're introduced to Abraham, and as always, we've spoken about this many times before. Anytime you have a story within our tradition, the earlier you get, the more fundamental it is to understanding. So we spoke about, why eating from the tree and what that means. Why is that the first story, that's chosen? So when you think about all the people in the universe that existed and somehow Avraham stood out above everybody else and that we're all descendants of him, we're not, even though we're descendants of Noach, we're not attributed to Noach. There are B'nai Noach out there. That's not our lot. There's something unique or many things unique about Avraham, and we're going to focus on one of them. So we're going to start with the following question, and I'd like you to answer it in your mind. You feel free to, if you want to throw out a comment, but obviously we're limited on time. Older or younger? Is it more impressive to be older or younger? What's better? Right? So there are many different ways we can slice that, right? It speaks about the fact in Pirkei Avos, for example, it says it's better to start teaching a younger person than an older person. It gives the example that a younger person is like a clean piece of paper, a brand new like whiteboard that's got absolutely no smudges, and an old person is like an old whiteboard, which even though it's cleanish and you got to write new notes, it's already got some of those permanent marks there that's hard to really, start from scratch, from fresh, because there's so much that it brings in that you can't rewrite the script as easily. And that's one area where it says perhaps maybe being younger is better. On the flip side, interestingly enough, when it comes to Avram actually asked God, please make me look old, which is the exact opposite of what people try to do. Every time, I don't go often, maybe once a year, that I have to get up to the bay on the third floor for something in the men's department. But the whole like main floor at the Yorkdale of the bay are all these products that are just trying to make people look 20 or 30 years younger than they actually are. And the question is obviously, why do people want to look younger? Why is that important? And along comes Avram, and the Midrash tells us, Avram says, God, I just want one favor from you. Please make me look old. And they explain, like, why does he want to look old? He says, listen, I'm walking around with my kid, and everybody thinks me and my kid have the same life experience because we're both looking 40. He says, but I'm 70, right? And I have 30 more years of experience, and I want that to show. I want the gray on my beard. I don't want to look like it's a fresh black beard and I'm a young kid. I'm a Zadie already. I've got some life experience. I can draw from different things. And looking old and being old is actually a positive in society in the sense that they carry wisdom with them that otherwise you couldn't get other than through life experience itself. And you have many different ways you can slice this old versus young approach. Young has possibilities, old has accomplishment, hopefully, right? Young can waste it away, right? Like we say, the youth is wasted on the young, but when we're older, we have to look back and either we've accomplished so much or not. So there's many different ways to approach it, but I want to highlight a really interesting Rambam, Maimonides, and a disagreement he has with one of his buddies called the Ravid. Anytime you look in a Rambam, the Rambam wrote a book called Mishnah Torah. Mishnah Torah goes through every single Jewish law in order of sections. So as opposed to when you're learning Talmud, which is thought provoking and interesting, it's almost like, a person on ADHD. It jumps from one topic to the next, and there's no structure or organization in topics. So if you want to find out, for example, I was giving a class at Federation on tzedakah, you've got to open up 7 different tractates of Talmud to pick out the verses on various pages because there's no tractate called tzedakah. So the Rambam comes along, as do many other codifiers, and they say, you know what? Let's take all this wisdom and have a nice little index, and we'll just go through holidays. We'll go through, Shabbat. We'll go through, Israel, and we'll create nice chapters. But in the beginning of it, he says, let's understand our people, where we come from. And he speaks about the progression of how Adam had this clarity of purpose and understanding. Yeah, he made a mistake, but he knew it was him and God, and he was making a mistake, and he had to do better. And then slowly over time, people went from, let's say, serving God to serving the stars and the moon, not directly, but they're like, wow, look at how beautiful this galaxy is. And just like, when people go into nature, sometimes they forget that there's a creator behind the creation. So they start to say, wow, the creation is awesome. But it's like walking up to a Mona Lisa and saying, wow, the Mona Lisa is awesome, but being like, it's only awesome because of the person who painted it. It has nothing to do with the painting is beautiful. But slowly over time, people forgot to focus on the creator and just focused on creation until you got to the point of idol worship. People literally would look at stones and mountains and totem poles and feel that they had power. And we're all familiar with Greek culture and mythology. And so you have this entire progression. Avram comes onto the scene, and like many of us might be familiar with, the famous midrash that his fathers in like idols are us. That's the family business, right? His Yerusha is a whole bunch of like, idols that he's got to sit there and, sell on the market. And one day his father goes out and he sits there, smashes the idols, and he makes a joke. He says, "Why'd you break the idols?" He says, "No, the idols got into a fight." Whatever the reason is, he's brought in this world of idol worship. And Avram, despite the fact that the whole world is thinking A, he has a very different opinion, not different than today in many ways as well, right? Even though the beauty of Avram was the entire world thought he was crazy, Avram knew what he knew, right? So even though you look at the news and we see we're depicted in a certain way, with the saddest thing, and I think Jews possibly last 2 years ago had forgotten how great we were, but now, despite whatever anybody says, we understand how special. Avram was fighting the entire world as a solo soldier, but he had to come from a place of totally different upbringing. And the Rambam talks about that when he's the age of 40, he all of a sudden realized there was this greater calling. He developed this relationship with God, understood that there's a higher ethical morality. And out of nowhere, he was able to develop this understanding. Now, the Rambam says it's the age of 40, but if you look on the page, the Ravid, who always pokes in and says, "By the way, Rambam, I disagree with you on this." The Ravid says, you know what? There's a midrash that says he wasn't 40 when he recognized like God and his mission. He was actually 3 years old. And at the age of 3, this child prodigy was able to realize, you know what, there's a much bigger picture going on in life. And the Ravid says, why don't you mention that opinion at 3? So the question that's asked by all the commentaries is, why did the Rambam say 40? Meaning, if I could tell you, let's say you want to sit there and hire somebody for your business and say, you know what, since the age of 3, this kid was a genius with numbers and structure. He was already one of these kids that had this, like, side business when he was in grade 3 and he was hustling. He made $10,000. He was always selling and buying and doing, and just amazing. So at 3, he did that. Versus if somebody says, you know, at the age of 40, he started to dabble in business a little bit. Yeah, he was pretty good at it. Which is more impressive, right? If you at 3 you're able to do something, or at 40. So the Ravid's opinion, right? He says, you know what? Mention the opinion of 3. If you want to talk about how great Abraham was, talk about this prodigy kid at the age of 3 that was able to figure out this complex thing despite, just being a kid. So that's the Ravid. But I want to focus on the Rambam's approach, which, because I don't believe we have any 3-year-olds on this call, right? The Rambam says, no, no, no. You want to know what's more impressive? What's more impressive is that for 40 years of Avram's life, he was brought up in a house of idol worship. What they talked around the table were things that were totally anti-ethical to Jewish values and life and understanding and philosophy and Weltanschauung, world perspective. And at the age of 40, he had the strength of character to rethink everything that he had been living and develop an entire new path based on when he thought what really makes sense, not what's my upbringing. See, a 3-year-old who's brought up in a certain environment and lives through that, obviously they're lucky in the sense that they never got challenged with trying to think otherwise, right? I'm running an event next week. There's a person who's originally from St. Catherine's. He was a devout Catholic. He became a ger, a convert. Now he's actually a bub of chassid, right? It's one thing to be brought up as a bubover. It's another thing to be brought up in St. Catherine's, right? And all of a sudden decide, you know what, maybe I should take a pivot in life. Right? It's easy for the kid that goes to cheder at 3, but for all of us, at any stage that we're at, the greatness of the human being is no matter what age they're at, if they're able to rethink, reassess, and then take a pivot, that was the greatness of Avram, which all of a sudden makes it so much more of a relatable and relevant message. Right? So many people are stuck in the way that they view things in their philosophy. And to be honest, so much of the way we view things in the philosophy that we have is based on a 3 or 4-year-old, upbringing. So we remember the stories we were taught or the thoughts that we had in grade school at certain points. And again, there is what to say, obviously, about one's influence in their home and their upbringing. But so much of our philosophy and what we've thought about has just been auto repeat, rinse and repeat over and over again based on whatever it was we did as a younger child. If someone said that's the way they approached anything in life, the way that the principles and that's it of their 3-year-old, and if a person had to budget the way a 3-year-old would budget, they'd probably have a house full of candy and nothing in savings because anytime they got more, they would just buy more candy. All of a sudden, you get older, you realize, wait, there's a thing called savings, there's things called health, there's other values that start to lay on. The person who retains that childhood character unfortunately continues playing out something which is not matured enough in terms of its thought process. So along comes the Rambam, and the Rambam says, you want to know what the greatness of Avram was and why he is so relevant and relatable to each one of us? Because it's not about a kid who was brought up always getting it right. It was a kid who had to struggle and work hard to break down those worships of idols, those useless types of approaches in life, and realize, okay, I might have made a mistake, but just because I happen to be on a wrong path doesn't mean tomorrow I can't change and turn it all around. And Avram, as a result of that, I think the amazing thing is Avram isn't just a nice guy. The Rambam says Avram becomes the leader of the Jewish people. There's a story they tell about the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I was just in New York, so I popped by the oil on my way back to LaGuardia. And I remember a story that, somebody once wrote a letter saying, I've been traveling from ashram to ashram, guru to guru, trying to find, what I should be doing. And it took me like 40 years. And now I finally realized, like the Jewish faith has something for me. What kind of teshuvah, what kind of repentance should I do? And the Rebbe was like, repentance? What do you mean? That was all your building block steps towards developing your understanding to arrive at this stage. That wasn't a waste of your life. That was a use of the experiences to search and explore until you finally arrived at an understanding which makes sense. He said, you're in great company. You and Abraham have a lot in common. Both of you only started your game at 40, which I think for us to remember, especially during this time, especially in a time where a Jewish heart is beating stronger than it's ever beat before, we all feel and think certain things about it. But we look back and say, well, you know what? I am, like I think Popeye used to say, I am who I am, and that's all that I am, right? This is who I am. But Avram's greatness wasn't that he was an ethical monotheistic founder. It's that he was able to rethink his life at the age of 40. And the Midrash actually goes on and says, some say 3, some say 40, some say 48, some say 75. And they say all those opinions are correct in the sense that they continue to develop over life. The way that I think at a 40-year-old and the depth of my understanding of my Jewish philosophy should not be the same at the age of 48. There's a beautiful book called Tzav V'Ziras. I went into New York. One of the reasons why I went in is there was a yahrzeit celebration for somebody called the Piazetzna Rebbe. You might know him as somebody called Eish Kodesh. It's actually a very big exhibit of his in the Holocaust Museum in Toronto. And in the beginning of his diary, he was murdered in Treblinka during the Holocaust. But he starts by saying, you know what, when you sit there and say, I'm Reuven, he says, and you think about who you want to be tomorrow, and you have your certain aspirations. He says, you want to make sure you achieve something so that the Reuven of next year is different than the Reuven of today. Because if the Reuven of today is the same as the Reuven of next year, basically, you didn't have a year of life. You didn't do anything with that. Avram's entire mission in life was constantly to be evolving. And that is why, as we finish at 9:45, that's why the parsha is called Lech Lecha. Avram's told, not like Noach. Noach comes from the word menucha, to rest, to sit. Noach sat on his laurels, says, okay, this is where I am. He might have been brought up in a better environment and he had a greater understanding, but he just said, that's it, I'm finished. Avram's opening words are Lech Lecha. You got to be a mover. You got to be growing and always exploring and expanding who you are. And that is the greatness of Avram. And I believe that's the greatness or the message to every single Jew as you start Lech Lecha, right? Where you are now is only the beginning. And the strength of Avram was to be able to reassess where he came from and then understand, more importantly, where he had to go as well. So, Chevra, 9:46, we got to close up. Wishing everyone a good Shabbos. We'll stop the recording. Obviously, if any questions, please feel free to. And wishing you guys an awesome Shabbos.